Hello, welcome to Lecture 13. We have three main objectives today. The first is to analyze class inequalities among societies. The second is to consider the debate over the relationship of globalization to inequality. And the third is to examine the rural-urban differentiation and how this relates to globalization. When we look at inequality, there are great inequalities, wide inequalities that exist both between and within societies. And this is one of the most pressing problems facing the world. Morally, we have to decide as a planet, at what point is it immoral or unethical to have so few people controlling so much of the world's wealth, income, and resources, while so many live in poverty and literally fighting to survive. At what point do we talk about human rights and the maldistribution of income and wealth and so forth? The other problem is that it's arguably not economically or politically sustainable. As the wealth gap widens, it creates more instability and possibly conflict among those who lack resources, income, wealth, or are fighting to survive. When there are so many people, basically fighting to survive, they have very little to lose, and this is not good for stability economically or politically, militarily. So it's a problem. World systems theory is a theory in sociology that's pretty well known for explaining economic inequality in a socio-historical way. And basically it looks at the development of the capitalist world system going back arguably clear to the 13th century. And I'm going to simplify a very complex historical argument, but basically the sooner that one enters the world system, the better, because they are the first to take advantage of capital accumulation, and they develop economic wealth and power, which is also accompanied by technologies and military power, and then they use that power to, and we can recall back to some earlier chapters, to colonize other nations, other areas, and exploit their resources and raw materials. And even after colonialism, as we've learned, there still remains these economic relationships between the colonizers and the formerly colonized. And we know that most of the countries that entered the world system first, most of them are in the global north, and most of the countries that have been colonized and are poor are in the global south. So what this theory does is looks at nation states and their relationship to the rest of the world when they came into the world system and how they came into the capitalist world system. Again, if you're coming in first and you are an empire and not a country that comes in later via colonialization, this is going to be a good situation for you. If you're a country that was colonized, there's a high likelihood that unless you got out of that colonization, became kind of an empire like the United States, that you are still less well off and trying to recover. We need to talk about the bottom billion, which is 2007 work by Collier. So if it was the bottom billion in 2007, it's likely substantially more than that now. There are over 7 million people in the world. But the notion of the bottom billion, these are basically the poorest of the poor, and it's sad that there are more than 1 billion. And these are folks who mostly live in the global south, and they live in Africa, about 70% of them, and they also live in other poor countries such as Haiti, Bolivia, Laos, North Korea, Yemen. And they have less than 1/5 of income of other developing countries. That's not 1/5 the income of affluent countries in the north. That's 1/5 the income of developing countries who are usually already poor. When we look at other problems that relate to low income, it compares badly with other nations. The bottom billion have a low life expectancy of only 50 years compared to 67 years in developing nations, and it's about 10 years more in affluent nations of the global north in terms of life expectancy. The bottom billion have infant mortality of 14% estimated who die before their fifth birthday compared to 4% for those in developing countries. They also more likely to be malnourished, 38% malnourished compared to 20% in developing countries. Now, your book talks about a number of different traps that nation states can face that will lead to impoverishment or trap them in impoverishment. The first is a conflict trap, and you hear quite a bit about this on the news. This is where nation states are confronted with either continuing civil wars or frequent violent coups d'etats. So they don't have stable governments, unlike countries in the global north who have had these sort of long-standing democratic, mostly democracies that are fairly stable, and therefore conflicts get resolved relatively peacefully. I'm not saying totally peacefully, but relative to countries where the bottom billion live, where it can just be outright civil war or with other countries. A natural resources trap is also something that limits people from recovering from impoverishment because they excessively depend on abundant natural resources and they may actually not have them. So we watched this video called The Uprooted for your last film review, and it talks about Central Africa and many of the rural farmers being driven into being refugees by climate change because of desertification, where previously fertile farmland became desert because of long-term drought, and this causes a climate refugee problem, which leads to lots of other problems. But definitely, we talked about comparative advantage earlier in the semester, where with globalization, countries can profit by finding a valuable resource to sell to other countries. And countries where the bottom billion live don't have resources to sell to other countries, and they lack resources to even satisfy the needs of their own populations. This can also be made worse, exacerbated by being landlocked, especially with bad neighbors. If you do not have access, let's say that you are a country that does have things to sell, trade, export, and you need to get to the ocean to ship them out, if you have a country or countries around you that you need to go through, but they are also conflict prone, for example, or lack the roads and transportation, then it makes it very difficult to be able to transport the things that you would sell that would bring money into the country. So that's being landlocked with bad neighbors. And then finally, there's the bad governance trap. And again, many of the countries, because they've lacked stability in government and really haven't established a political system, this creates instability and turnover and different kinds of governance, and opens up the possibility or likelihood of corruption. And so this bad governance just further contributes to the problems, the other kinds of traps, conflict, natural resources, and being landlocked. Healthcare is another problem in poor countries and for the bottom billion. There are growing disparities despite an increase in the aggregate global life expectancy. So overall, life expectancy is going up. We are continuing to develop healthcare technologies that extend the life of people who have access to healthcare, but that's the problem. There is declining access to healthcare and nutrition, and this results in low productivity. So again, if you have a workforce in a developing nation that is starving and not healthy, it's very difficult to produce efficiently or enough materials and so forth to climb your way out of impoverishment. The bottom billion are disproportionately affected by disease and malnutrition, as are many in developed countries. And they can face a double nutrition burden, which restricts access to food or access to unhealthy food. And I believe I said developed, I meant developing. So this double burden that applies to the bottom billion and developing nations means that not only can they not have food, for many of them, there's another group that is getting access to food, but it's carbohydrates, it's not a healthy or nutritious diet, and they eat too much of it, which can actually, among the poor, produce obesity and diabetes and other healthcare problems related to obesity. Also, in developing countries, one is more likely to smoke because as developed countries have found out about the dangers of smoking and have regulated it, tobacco companies have gone to poor nations with their marketing and advertising and sales efforts, which is producing the same kinds of problems, lung cancer, emphysema, and so forth, that we've seen in this country. We also have to talk about the global digital divide, because increasingly being competitive on a global economic level requires access to information technology, access to the internet. And it's a big problem because, as you can guess, if we're talking about entire nations that can't find food, then they are not very likely to have computers and access to the internet. And in a global information kind of society, access to the internet is extremely advantageous economically. Language is also a problem, as 80% of the internet content is in English. So getting access is one thing, but then will it be in the language that you speak? And because, impoverished nations, developing nations, especially the poorest, they speak languages that can be fairly local or regional, that people who are basically putting on web content are not making it available in their language. So the solution would be that they either learn English or some other language where there's ample availability, depending on what region of the world they're in, which is a problem, again, because of lack of access to healthcare and food, and education is right there with it, or more content is made available in their language. Either way, it's problematic. And this has enormous implications for the ability to contribute to or take part in many global flows, particularly economic global flows, because we've talked about the globalization of banking and finance and currency and so forth, and all of those things require pretty sophisticated information technology structures. Another problem related to information technology is e-waste, and e-waste is electronic waste. So in affluent countries, we have all of these gadgets that many of us depend on to get our jobs done, and communicate with our coworkers, our friends, our families, and so forth. And the iPhone 10 is out, so people will be ditching their old iPhones. Well, where does it all go? And it historically has been shipped from affluent countries to poorer countries because it's toxic and we don't want it. And there is a market for taking apart electronics and recycling materials and so forth. But as you can imagine, that's a very dangerous job because of all the toxic ingredients, mercury and so forth, that you would be exposed to when you do that. And unfortunately, even though there's been a treaty to prohibit that, it still occurs illegally. So we have large amounts of e-waste moving around the world and being disposed of and disassembled by some of the poorest people in the world And of course, working with e-waste is likely to exacerbate all of the health problems that are already occurring, as a workforce in a very poor country is unlikely to be able to afford the kinds of protection in terms of clothing and ventilation that one would need to safely take apart, dispose of, recycle e-waste. And the income that is earned from the disposal of e-waste is pretty meager, especially when you have to account for the cost of the health problems, the injuries, and disease. There's a general agreement that inequality exists, global inequality, and as I said, pretty general agreement that it's a big problem. But there are debates about how you reduce global inequality. And there's also debates about the impact of globalization on inequality in terms of whether it reduces it or increases it. Some problems result from methodological issues and decisions made about the measurement of inequality and the ability to make comparisons. So I just got done talking about the bottom billion and the conditions in the countries where they live. You can imagine it's hard to take a survey on income and wealth and so forth, or use government data, when you're lacking the history of government or people who actually took data. So there are vastly different conclusions that are made and can be related to different theoretical approaches to globalization. And your book does a good job of going over a couple of them. Firebaugh and Gosling in 2007 claim that modernization, remember modernization theory, is in developing countries is reducing income and health inequalities. So they're focused on, remember modernization theory focuses on industrialization. So they believe that the more industrialized a country, the more equal it will become. And they say this for a number of reasons, particularly as the aging population in affluent countries decreases. This should open up many more jobs for large populations that are not decreasing in developing countries. That's one idea. Also, Tom Friedman, going back to The World is Flat, his book, talks about the elimination of barriers to trade, which he thinks will enrich everyone. And these are basically, Friedman's is definitely a theory about what globalization should do. Firebaugh and Gosling is a theory looking at sort of static comparisons of how much global income, resources, and so forth are present in a country. And your book talks about the data that they use, and even the data that they use, if they were to look at it again right now, researchers are suggesting that even with that data, we see increasing global inequality. So if you had to ask me which one I believe right now that global inequality is increasing. And it's not just income, it's wealth. When you start to look at wealth statistics in the last 50 years and compare the top fifth to the bottom fifth, that ratio has increased pretty dramatically. So another theory is world systems theory. And when we talk about world systems theory like we have, I think that it's basically pointing out to global dynamics, in terms of who produces and who owns. And ownership is largely the possession of corporations and wealthy people in the global north. And when you own property, you can use it to accumulate capital. When you don't own anything or have a very low level of ownership, as is the case in many countries of the global south, then it's very difficult to modernize. Now, many people are going to talk about China as an example. Many people who would talk about inequality decreasing due to globalization are going to talk about China. And definitely China has economically developed in a historically unprecedented way over the last 50 years. But it's important to note that they've done so because of the low wages of so much of their population, over 1 billion low wage workers in China. So the idea that all of them sort of become affluent and increase their standard of living is one that is problematic at best. There are many problems, including the world's climate and the world's environment being able to sustain a great deal more consumer waste and industrial production for 1 billion more people in China when it's already struggling to do so right now, given class relationships in the world. Let's talk now about global inequalities in terms of rural and urban populations. It's really important. If you want, there is one thing we can say with certainty, is that the poorest overall are, or at least historically have been, in rural populations, and the richest have been areas of the city. That's where your areas of affluence are, in the cities. Now it's important to note that as the rural have been displaced from rural areas to the cities, they often make up large and growing populations of poor people in the cities who have migrated but don't find opportunities in large cities. But urban and rural inequality is pretty central to the inequality issue on a global level. And here are a few reasons why. First of all, the relations of agricultural production have changed, largely due to post-World War II United States, Marshall Plan, and also the conglomeration, the concentration of corporations like Monsanto and Cargill, agribusiness, the large rise of agribusiness, and industrial factory farming methods that are very energy intensive, and also protectionist policies that have protected especially the United States, and are a big subject. I think we've discussed this a couple of times, a source of discontent on the part of Europe and many other nations around the world. Arguably, world food prices are not high enough to sustain food that is, or to make a profit on food that is grown sort of the old way. The yields aren't high enough, and in smaller countries that are trying to compete with larger countries like the United States, when you look at Mexico, for example, who basically can grow corn, it's the best place to grow corn. It has largely been replaced, Mexican corn, by cheap subsidized corn in the United States. And people argue that if it were not for the large subsidies paid by our government to agribusinesses and to farmers, that it would not be, that our rural populations would be in big trouble, just as rural populations in other parts of the world are in trouble due to low food prices that are sort of artificially created, arguably, by governments that are subsidizing their agricultural sector. And in much of the world wants the United States to stop doing that, because were they not doing that, for example, going back to the Mexican corn example, things would be a little bit different. Mexican corn was purchased by Mexican people until after NAFTA, when that opened up the door, and because Mexico would use tariffs and protectionist policies to keep other corn out, but also they shouldn't have had to do that if the United States wasn't subsidizing its corn, making it cheaper. And I'm not sure you understand that, but a subsidy means that, okay, if corn prices are too low for a farmer to actually grow the corn and sell it, the government will give them X number of dollars per bushel if they will grow it and sell it anyway. And so then we end up with a massive corn surplus, and that is used for things like soda, but also to export to other countries. Also, a great deal of our agricultural crops will go toward foreign aid for poor nations, which again is a problem, because many argue that if things were fair, if we weren't in these conditions of post-colonialism, imperialism, and so forth, and dependence, that they would be able to grow their own food and get a good price for it, rather than being dependent on foreign aid. And so this has created what your book calls the relations of resistance. So the relations of social production and agriculture are the processes through which populations survive within institutions that govern material condition. There is a relations of resistance which consists of hundreds of organizations of farmers, for example, made up of farmers trying to oppose these exploitative global practices. But you know, things are really bad for rural populations, and when you watch the video on Central Africa and California, you will see examples of farmers just having to get off the land because the land is no longer arable. So that basically, in sum, global agriculture has been really almost monopolized by a few large global agribusinesses who have been able to exert great influence on political institutions, both within nations and global political institutions, which have really put farmers, especially in developing countries, at a very big disadvantage when compared to agriculture in the global north, where it's more likely to be subsidized by governments, especially the United States. So when we go to the urban areas, obviously there are very large cities that more and more people live because they are the centers of global trade, of global finance, and of other sectors that operate internationally. And Saskia Sassen had made this term called global cities. And so if you want to know what the literature says are the three most important global cities in the world, are you ready for it? It's London, it's New York, and it is Tokyo. Now, prior to Sassen, John Friedman, not Thomas, wrote about world cities. And I don't have time to go over that in this lecture, but take a look at your book, because it's very much like the global cities approach. I think he was influential for Sassen, but it lists more cities and what they're really important for. And so you can see that large cities establish these sectors where people go to participate in them, and it attracts the world's most affluent people and corporations. Now, with this growth, we also get many workers, and we get many displaced from agriculture that will go to the cities with no other choice existing in rural areas. Without agriculture, there's no farming. With no farming, there's not much of a rural economy. So they will migrate to the cities. And your book talks about the growth of megacities, which are more than 10 million people. And this can also lead to what's called a megalopolis, which is a chain of interconnected cities with the potential of becoming one huge city. So if we look up and down the coast of California, from San Francisco to LA, that's an example of an emergent megalopolis. The same with New York, Boston, Washington, and on down the East Coast. So those are two places in the United States that can happen. But if we go back to megacities for a second, not only are they the center for global exchange, there are also some very large countries that don't have the affluence, that don't have the outreach globally, and so they tend to be defined more by their poverty than their affluence. And Karachi, Pakistan is one of those cities that your book talks about. And I just want to read real quick some of the problems in Karachi. There's a deteriorating infrastructure that was built for a much smaller population. City services like power are unreliable and non-existent for many. There are massive slums. Clean drinking water is difficult to obtain and costly. There's enormous growth, but it's unplanned, and building is uncontrolled. There's garbage, enormous amounts of garbage that's a source of work and income for many, There are people called pickers who just go through the dumps and pick out recyclables and are paid small amounts of money for that. But you can imagine it's very dangerous work. There's enormous traffic jams. There is economic activity that takes place mainly on the streets, and not all of it's legitimate. Worsening, I should say, much of it is illicit. There's worsening air pollution, gang violence. One of the world's most largest population of street children, 1.2 to 1.5 million children living on the streets in Karachi. A murder rate of 25%. That's higher than any other megacity in the world, and a ranking of 6th in the least livable city in the world. Obviously, from this description, we see that cities are the main locus of global problems. And there are not only inequalities within cities, but also between them. I think when we saw the Olympics in Rio, for those of you who were watching any of that, there were quite a few stories on this sort of contrast between the affluent part of the city and the beautiful coastline, but also the slums, massive amount of slums, and some of the problems with infrastructure and so forth that they were dealing with trying to host the Olympics. So cities might be major beneficiaries of globalization, but they're also most affected by global problems. And they are less able to react and solve the problems faced in their cities as these problems become more global in nature. So, for example, Los Angeles and air pollution from China. I think I've talked about that, but the leading source of air pollution in Los Angeles comes over from China. And Los Angeles produces plenty enough of its own air pollution. So, how to deal with this when the problem is not strictly local. So in sum, we do have large economic inequalities that exist between and within different regions, nations, and cities. And I don't think I mentioned, even within the United States, when we look at healthcare, for example, because we have a more economically unequal nation than many developed countries in Europe, we also have problems with healthcare and life. We don't live as long as other countries in the global north. We have more problems with infant mortality and obesity, malnutrition, and so forth than do other affluent countries. And the argument is made because of the inequality and because of the growing number of poor who just don't have access to health care and other resources as the affluent in our nation do. So this inequality pattern is not only happening domestically in poor countries, but it's also happening within affluent countries. And remember, there is a great deal of argument that it's no longer the nation that matters. It's sort of where you live in the world in relationship to areas of affluence. So you can be poor in an affluent country.